Dear guests, welcome to our HBR live session. We are continuing to bring you together with the most prominent thought leaders and trying to better understand the COVID era and post-COVID era, if I may say. Before we start, I would like to remind you about some of the things that we are going through today. As you already know, our stream is going live via YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter simultaneously. And we receive the questions by YouTube chat bar. So if you want to ask us questions, please join us in our YouTube channel. So today I am more than happy to host Professor Frances Frei. Frances' research generally focuses on strategy, operations, and culture. She also advises many corporations. And as much as I know, she has a terrific experience in Uber. So Frances, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to join you.
It's my pleasure to host you. So just how are you holding up throughout this COVID-19 era? How are you affected personally?
Yeah, so I think that, in my immediate family, there's been some health issues, which makes me absolutely typical in terms of that. And then in the neighborhoods and things like that, I can see the financial impact. So I would say typically in terms of the health and economy.
Yeah. Actually, guys, I am a little bit lucky person because our parent company, Harvard Business Publishing, is one of the leading business book publishers in the world. And I had a chance to see some of the books before they go out to print. I have an access before they print out. So a couple of months ago, I was just sorting out around some books, and I ended up with a book titled Unleashed, The Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You. And I was thinking, this is another book about empowerment, which is a 100-year-old issue we have been talking about. But when I started to read a couple of pages, I was just stunned, and I couldn't stop reading it till the end. So that was a really fascinating book, Frances. Congratulations for that. So just tell us about the title. What does it mean? Unleashed, the Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You. What is the idea behind that?
Yeah, and I'll start with the subtitle, which is that in and it's meant for each word sort of collectively in the sentence, but a leader's guide, so as you mentioned, empowerment is talked about all the time, but hasn't been effective, which means we haven't gotten to the root cause and to the granular way to do it. In our experience, that's because leaders haven't taken it as central to their mission, that their sole job, most important job, is to set other people up for success. And because that's such an unusual stance, we encourage people to do it not with apology, but to do it unapologetically. Don't do it with sheepishness, but that to be proud of the fact that my worth as a leader can be seen in the performance of others. And here's what we know about it. Once you establish that, empowering is a super important part of how to accelerate the performance of others. And so when we're done, we will have unleashed the potential in everyone around us. And so that's the cocktail of the words coming together.
Yeah, that's good. Can you elaborate a little bit about this empowerment issue? Because as much as I know, we have been writing tons of literature and articles about that for decades. So why is it still not a resolved issue?
Because I think we haven't understand the micro operational implications of how to do it. And I think we're going to have this conversation. You're probably going to ask this question about many words. And what we've tried to do is really get to the operational manifestation of it and give people the tools in how to do it, not simply state that it's an important thing to do. So for each thing, so for empowerment, there are 6 rings of empowerment, and we go through all of them. And super tangibly, here's what you do first, here's what you do second, here's what you do third. And I think that comes from my operational background. And I'm hopeful that this will be the way that we unleash other people in being able to operationalize it.
Yeah. When I first look at the table of contents of the book, I was surprised that it has been divided into 2 main chapters. The first chapter was presence, and the second chapter was absence. So what does presence and absence need to do with leadership?
Yeah, so our definition of leadership is that leadership is about making other people better. So leadership is not about us, it's about others. Leadership is about making other people better, first as a result of our presence, then into our absence. Said differently, it's okay if you're reliant on me in the beginning, but my job to fully unleash you, to fully empower you, is that you do great even in my absence. Now, my absence might start off when I'm not in the room, when I go home for the night, when I go away for a weekend or a vacation. But we think the truest test is when you leave the job. Have you set people up for success, or have you set them up for reliance? Because if I can only be successful in your presence, then I'm not sure how useful you were to the firm because you didn't set anything up in an enduring way. So we really want people to understand how to empower people in their absence, but you got to do it in your presence first.
Yeah. One of the things we have been discussing recently is short-termism versus long-termism. And when we try to condemn people with the thinking of short-termism, the argument that we are using is, okay, those people think short-term, they want to take all the credit, and they don't want to go for long-term projects because they are not sure that they will be there to collect the credit. For instance, if a CEO is planning to go under a 5-year, 7-year project that will pay off in 5 years, 7 years, and she or he thinks that she won't be there, and her successor is going to get the credit, and she will pay the burden. So when you look at this point, do you think this absence thing has been comprehended in a way that is constructed by the leaders?
Well, so I think we're the first people to talk about it, at least in this way. And the book came out 3 days ago. So I think I want to look to see if it will start to be digested. But what you just described is a really beautiful example of incorrect incentives. Because there's no way from a macro perspective, like if I really cared about the company, I don't want a leader to collect credit. I don't want a leader to stop performing when they're no longer collecting credit. Like you just described an environment where if you don't get the incentives right, that kind of behavior will happen. What you described is certainly not optimal for any system perspective. And so that's actually what we're trying to address. I also think that it's not very satisfying to individuals. I mean, it's great for people to say, oh, we really miss you here. You know, things aren't the same without you. And it's a little ego nourishing, but it should quickly become depressing because you didn't actually, when you look back in your history of your experience on this planet, if you're required, that like terminates, and that's like hardly a legacy.
Yes, indeed. And one of the things that I really like about the book is that you introduce the notion of habit of self-destruction for leaders. So most of the leaders get on their way and they develop a habit of self-destruction, if I may say. What are some signals of this, and how can leaders avoid this self-destruction thing?
Yeah, so, and you know, in their defense, we have been encouraging them to be self-distracted. We collectively, because we're saying to the leaders, you know, look at yourself, you know, put a mirror up, like make sure, like this is all about you. And what we're trying to do is say, we want to flip that 180 degrees. As a leader, I don't want you to be thinking about you. I want you to be thinking entirely about other people. So when you walk into a room, I don't want you to think you're the most important person in the room. I don't want you to be happiest when all eyes are on you. I want you to be happiest when you are setting each person up in the room for success for when they leave the room. But we have been training leaders to think it's all about them. And I'm hopeful that this will contribute to the training them that is actually you will not get nearly as good of performance as you're about to if you flip that to my performance is all about other people.
Great. And my personal area of interest is also trust, and there is a very good chapter in your book about trust. But before this COVID era, we started to discuss that people trust less to organizations, less to leaders, less to politicians. So there was a huge decline of trust to every single institution, if I may say. So what is the reason for that, according to your opinion? Why do we start trusting less to institutions and leaders?
And I think trust has been declining on average, but I don't think it's every single institution. There are some leaders and some institutions that engender great trust. I think that that's similar to empowerment. If we just say, oh, I want to have more trust, let's work on trust, it wasn't actionable. Like it wasn't well enough understood, so you could talk about it theoretically, but you didn't know what to do to build more trust tomorrow. So we got down to the operational roots of trust, and we found out that there are 3 component parts. And what's beautiful is each of those component parts diagnose which one is getting in your way, and we have a prescription for you to fix it by tomorrow. And I think, if anything, that's what we're trying to do in this book, is to give you, the tools and techniques to be able to implement immediately.
Great. So speaking of trust, when I also speak about trust or write about trust, people say, okay, Serdar, that's a very good issue. That's a very important issue. We know that it's very important. We know what it is, but we don't know how to build and sustain trust. What is the framework, or what is the formula to build it? So I'm just forwarding this question to you. What are the components of trust now? How we can be aware of it?
Yeah. So the 3 component parts of trust are authenticity, logic, and empathy. You need to have, I'll tell you what they are in a moment, but you need to have all 3. If trust breaks down, it's because either authenticity or logic or empathy broke down. So that's your formula. Now I'll tell you what it means. You are less likely to trust me if you doubt my authenticity. If you doubt it's the real me speaking to you. If you think I'm delivering a message that I don't really believe in, you'll be able to pick up on it immediately. And the first thing will go is your trust in me. Authenticity is necessary, but not sufficient. You also, if you just think my rigor is inconsistent and that I say things that contradict with each other, or I'm not comprehensive, you're going to be less likely to trust me. And finally, if you think it's all about me, like if you think I'm the most important and I'm only interested in you to the extent that it overlaps with me, that I'm not really in it for you, you're going to doubt my empathy, you're not going to trust me. So go to any situation in the world for an individual or institution and look why trust is broken down. So far, we have been able to trace it always to one of these 3 things. If there was a 4th, we would have made it a trust quadrangle instead of a trust triangle. And then what gave us confidence is that in reflecting on what Aristotle said a long time ago, when he would talk about logos, pathos, and ethos, that also connects to these. And so that gave us confidence that these 3 might be sufficient, but we remain totally open that there could be a 4th one. But it's stabilized to 3, and we've done this now with more than 100,000 people, and it's still stable at 3.
Yeah, authenticity, logic, and empathy. So can you just elaborate a little bit on all of those 3? How can we understand, for instance, that our problem is a logic, or how can we understand that it is authenticity?
Yeah, so here's what the exercise I ask individuals, and so the folks that are participating right now, here's like a very brief exercise you could do with yourself, which is, you're probably trusted most of the time, but bring into your mind's eye a recent example when you didn't build as much trust as you wanted to. So you have to have a real example and recent example. And then for that example, ask yourself, and I'll tell you what, like an example for me is that my senior colleagues at HBS tended to trust me less than my junior colleagues at HBS. And so when I went and looked at it, did they doubt it was the real me speaking to them? They didn't. They thought I was being very authentic. Did they doubt the rigor of my logic? Not really. They could see it. They rigor understands rigor. They got it. But they completely doubted my empathy. They doubted that I really understood what it's like to be a senior tenured member of the faculty, and I had not yet been a senior member of the faculty, and I didn't do the work to really understand their perspective. So my perception that they didn't trust me is completely my fault, because I hadn't done the work for empathy. And when I started to do that work with one at a time, we rebuilt trust between us. So for whatever your situation is, ask yourself, were you not trusted because people doubted it was the real you? They doubted the rigor of your logic, or they doubted that you were in it for them? And whichever one of those it is, we can give you the prescription. That you have to get the accurate diagnosis of those three. We give you the prescriptions on how to overcome any of them.
And the notion of, I think you call some of those notions wobbles, right?
Oh, I do.
Something that derails you out of this journey.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you get the diagnosis, so I had in that case an empathy wobble. We say wobble because we don't want it to be, it's not fatal. Everyone has a wobble. All of us are not trusted at some point. So we want you to diagnose it like really rigorously, but don't condemn yourself. Just have can-do spirit that you're going to fix it tomorrow. So we call it a wobble.
Great. So, and there are also anchors. So what are anchors and why are they important?
Yeah, so the reason that the other exercise we would ask you to do, and you can do it for an organization or an individual, but which one of these three things would it be super hard to wobble within you? Like, which one is just like, it's of you? And for whichever one that is, we call it your anchor. And here's why. We love people coaching one another to help them get better. You can particularly do it for trust. But we noticed a really troubling common thing, which is that I would see two empathy wobblers talking to each other and coaching each other. If you're an empathy wobbler, you should have no confidence in coaching another empathy wobbler. So we wanted you to come up with what your anchor is, so you should know, oh, I can coach on this, and I probably shouldn't coach on the other ones. And that was to let peer-to-peer coaching happen, but to do it responsibly.
Great. So this trust issue is an issue that we can do a whole session on it, but I think it is becoming very important. Do you also see that it is gaining more and more importance in terms of organizational contexts?
Well, we think it's the foundation of everything. So it's the foundation of empowerment leadership. And by foundation, we mean don't bother with anything else we talk about unless you know how to build and rebuild trust. That is, all of the time on the other stuff, you will get an unsatisfying return until you do this. So trust first. That's what we mean by foundation. Once you have trust, then you can go to the next ring and the next ring and the next ring. So I also think, because we're of the time we're in globally, with this first health, then financial, like we're in a destabilized time. That's when trust, one of those three things, tends to wobble. And so it is really important to be building and rebuilding trust every day. I mean, every economy in the world is built on trust. And when we start to lose confidence, we're losing trust, then we got to rebuild it.
Yeah. Another thing about authenticity, some critics believe that showing authenticity or real self is a way of vulnerability. So, and we know that most of the top managements or leaders are not very fond of being vulnerable in front of people. So is there a trade-off between this being the strong and the absolute leader versus being authentic?
So this is, again, where I would shift it to other people. So as a leader, my job is to set the conditions for your vulnerability to show up. I am indifferent to whether or not you are vulnerable or not. I very much care if you can set the conditions for other people to be vulnerable. Some people find by being vulnerable, that sets the conditions for other people to be vulnerable. But some people find they can do other things aside from being vulnerable. So I don't care, dear leader, if you're vulnerable. I don't think you should care either. but you should definitely care if you set the conditions for other people's vulnerability to show up.
Right. And let's close this trust issue here because I can talk about trust till morning. So I'm cutting it up here. The second part of the analogy is love. So love looks like or sounds like a fluffy word when it comes to leadership or that. Is it so?
No, and nor is trust. So if you go to the rings of empowerment, the first one is set a foundation of trust. Next level, set the conditions for one person at a time to thrive. So I have to bring out the best in you as an individual. That's love. We're next going to go to get to belonging, which is how do I set the conditions for even more people at the same time and more varied people. So it goes foundation of trust, set the conditions for one person, set the conditions for many people. We find if you can really set the conditions for someone else to thrive, that is the truest expression of love. So that's why we call it love. And the way you do it, there's two levers. And so here we're super operationally detailed. If I want to set you up for success, I have to do two things simultaneously that I probably instinctually do one at a time. So this tells us when we have to do both simultaneously. And if I want to set the conditions for you to thrive, I have to set super high standards for you. Very few people thrive in the presence of low standards. But I also have to reveal my deep devotion to your success. And what we find in practice is that when I'm setting high standards, I kind of turn off my devotion a little bit. And then I might get some feedback that I was chilly or stern or too much. I get a little horrified. And so then I over-index on being deeply devoted. And without even knowing it, I lower the standards. And then I get horrified about the impact on performance. And then I go back and forth and back and forth. The chapter on love shows us how to do both simultaneously. And it's only when we do them both simultaneously that we get to get extraordinary performance out of people. And that, again, is what we think love really means.
So love can be a huge leverage when it comes to bringing out the potential of the other people, which is the most important job of the leader, if I may say.
Indeed.
How about belonging? Because it's also a very long time being discussed kind of an issue.
Yeah.
And with new generations are coming, it is not easy to establish belonging and inclusion throughout the companies. And we know that the talent is, when you can combine belonging with talent, that it's a huge competitive advantage. So what's your take on belonging?
Yeah. So trust has 3 components. Love has 2, belonging has 4. So I actually hadn't realized the numeric sequence of it, but this is why we hope we're going to make disproportionate progress on these things. So you already mentioned the competitive advantage of getting more and more varied people to thrive. So I'll now tell you how to do it. And when more and more varied people are thriving, every one of us feels of the place and we feel like we belong. Inclusion. So many people talk about diversity and inclusion. And now you might talk about equity and you might talk, like there's other words. But if I just take the diversity and inclusion, I really want to switch the words. Because it's not, when I bring in difference, when I bring in diverse perspectives, I may or may not be inclusive of those diverse perspectives. That is, I might bring in someone who's different and ask them to act just like everyone else. That is not being inclusive, right? So diversity doesn't always lead to inclusion, but inclusion almost always leads to diversity. Because if you're inclusive of everyone, if each one of us feels like we get to fully show up, I promise you, more diverse perspectives are going to flock to you. So now here's how you do inclusion, because I can see, so we know that we call it an inclusion dial because, again, you have to do one, then the other, then the other. The first thing is, despite any difference that I might represent to an organization or to a team, I have to feel safe to bring that difference forward. Safety is like the bottom rung of inclusion. And if we look at what's going on in the world, if we look at what's going on in the US today we just all saw the murder of George Floyd because of the color of his skin. Like there's just no other explanation for it. That's been going on for 400 years in this country. Like we have never come to terms with race in this country. Black people in the US often don't feel safe. Don't bother going to the other rings of inclusion until we can create the conditions for people to feel safe. That's the first one. Once I feel safe, despite the difference that I represent, I now need to feel welcome despite. So you know what it's like when you feel welcomed. Like you have welcomed me here magnificently. I can feel the welcome. I get that you want me to bring my unique perspectives. I totally understand that. So it goes safe and welcome despite any difference I might represent. And then it turns the corner to competitive advantage. Because then I am celebrated for my unique contribution. And that one, it gets really tricky because we usually celebrate people for similarity without even knowing it. And so we have to flip that switch to celebrate difference. So I go to the Harvard Business School classroom. If somebody says something that I was going to say, chances are I'm going to go and celebrate. I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, that was awesome what you said. I was going to say the same thing. Without knowing it, I just celebrated sameness. Instead, I'd like to give that gift of celebration. Holy cow, you said something I totally wouldn't have thought of. That was awesome. I'm celebrating difference. It's subtle, it's everything. So it goes safe, welcome, celebrated, and then is my difference like truly cherished by the organization? Like, am I here for my unique contribution? Not just when I'm lucky enough to be on this call with you, but in each interaction with the organization. So inclusion as a word, nobody knows how to make progress on it. But we totally understand what safety means. We understand what welcome means. We understand what celebrated means. And so when we move up the inclusion dial, that's when we have seen my team will thump your team. If you have people that are all like you, and I have people that that are very different than me, and I've been inclusive of that difference. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who I am. I'm going to thump you because I get the benefit because I was inclusive of difference. That's what we mean by
especially when it comes to team management, diversity and inclusion becomes a huge issue. And there is always a tension or a comparison between homogeneous teams versus inclusive teams or diverse teams. So in your book, you mentioned that sometimes homogeneous teams can be more or can outperform some diverse teams because of the lack of inclusion. So you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So listen, if I bring together a diverse team, a team that's filled with difference, but I'm not inclusive of that difference, everyone is going to just conform to what we have in common. That's our natural instinct. Find the common ground. Well, the more varied I am, the less common ground there is. And so if I'm diverse without inclusion, I may well underperform a team where everyone's the same and our common ground is much larger. So and this is called the common information effect, but it's being diverse without being inclusive isn't very good for the team and is kind of terrible for the individuals. Because you know what stinks? Being brought in for your unique perspective and then only asked to talk about what is in common with everyone else. So what I'm trying to do here, and what Anne and I wrote about, is that we're trying to convince people that the most interesting thing about each person on your team is what's unique to them. It's not what's in common. The least interesting thing about you is what I already know. The least interesting thing about me is what you already know.
Great. So I really love the notion of celebrating differences rather than celebrating similarities and just bringing up diversity with inclusion, which will, I think, be the obvious leverage for success. And there are a couple of questions that I would like to bring up from the audience.
Oh, I love that. I'm just writing down as you talk so that I...
Yes, you're free to write it down. So we have been going through this COVID thing, and it's like a stress test for all the leaders. So how do you see the performance of today's leaders throughout COVID era in general?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Use whatever your interpretation is performance. But we have leaders on a global scale of countries and regions. Line them all up for whatever you think countries are performing best to worst. And then take a look at those leaders in the scale of, is it all about them? Or are they really in it for others? There's going to be a super high correlation. Countries that are doing well have leaders that it's not all about them. They really are about setting other people up for success. Countries that have struggled, the leaders tend to be, it's all about me. And so I think at this moment in time, I mean, it's a coincidence. We wrote the book before this. At this moment in time, this definition of leadership is super important.
Great. So another question is about the empowerment for non-leaders, if I may say, the people in the front line or the mid-level managers or the managers below mid-level. So we always talk about high-level managers, top managers, C-level, but how about people, the ordinary people, ordinary workforce that would like to empower their peers or their bosses? So what's the take on that?
Yeah. So what you just did in that sentence, which was beautiful, is you brought up the concept of management and leadership. Management is your hierarchy, right? So if I'm managing people, I'm a manager. If I'm managing managers, I'm a mid-level manager, and so on. Leadership can occur anywhere. Management is according to a strict hierarchy. So notice our definition of leadership. Leadership is about making other people better. Anyone can do that. So young people in an organization on some issues are absolutely the leaders. In fact, I would say in most organizations, sustainability, like the desire for it, totally comes from younger people in the organization. People lower on the management hierarchy, but they are leading. So I love your separation. We have to teach a lot of people about management. This is a book about leadership. It's about anyone can take on the role of leader.
Great. So another question is about the gender equality. I think our guest is trying to emphasize that some sociologists or scholars in sociology are mentioning that all the things that we are going through, this COVID and uncertainty, will affect the gender equality issues in a negative way. Do you believe that this era or what we are going through will have a negative effect on gender equality or maybe representation of women in business ranks?
I don't even understand the argument for why it would matter one way or the other. Can you? I hadn't heard that, and I don't understand why it would matter.
Maybe I rephrased it in a little different way. Maybe Emel Hanım will be elaborating more about this on us. But let me follow up with this empowerment issue. We all see that there are lots of trainings going through. There are lots of courses in corporations about speaking up, developing trust, getting feedback. Not relative with this question, but in general. Do you think these kind of trainings, these kind of programs are effective in order to do this, or is there another way to do that?
Yeah, so they can be effective and they can be ineffective. It depends on what they're done. So let me take feedback as an example. If I'm training you on how to give feedback, well, we know, in my view, there's only one reason to give feedback, and that is to help make someone else improve. When I give you feedback, if you get better, I gave you effective feedback. If you got worse, I gave you ineffective feedback. So that, I just want to reframe it there. So a lot of people think, oh, I gave you the hard feedback. Nonsense. Did they get better? You were effective. Did they get worse? You were ineffective. Some people are like, I said what I had to say, and it's up to them to get better. Nonsense. So that's the first thing. My job is to make you better. Well, we know well how to make another person better with feedback. I can classify all feedback into two buckets. Positive reinforcement. So of the 100 things you did today, here are the 10 that were really awesome, and I want you to do even more of them tomorrow. So it tells you what to do that you've already done. Do this more often and repeatedly. Positive reinforcement. Constructive advice. Here are the things you did. Do this one differently in order to get a better outcome, right? So those are the two things, positive reinforcement, constructive advice. You should give about 5 times as much positive reinforcement as constructive advice if your goal is for someone to improve. Because, right, but most people instinctually do the opposite. They think that constructive advice is the real feedback. And listen, if 1 to 5 worked, but I have never seen it work. 5 to 1 of positive reinforcement, but you can't say good job. I have to say sincerely and specifically, when you did this, like the prep you did for this interview is amazing. And you asked me things in the right question, like I'm being sincere and specific. So then you know what to do repeatedly. So if you do that for feedback, it'll totally help a company. But if you try to do something else, like how to have difficult conversations, oh, please. How to improve people's performance with feedback. Do that, it'll work great.
Great. So one of the things that pops in my mind just before this call was that trust, authenticity, or empathy, or feedback taking and giving, all those things or all those notions are very much effective when you are face-to-face, when you are seeing the face of the person. And now we are going through a much more digitalized way of doing business, and it seems that it is going to be in place for a while. So do you think feedback, developing trust, showing authenticity will be affected by this digital way of doing working in a negative way, or there are still ways to achieve this?
So I think the formulas are still the same, but the way in which you go after the formulas is going to be different. For example, if I'm setting you up for success, let's say you're my direct report, and before all of this, we met once a week, and I found that the cadence of meeting with you once a week, I could really set you up for success. If I simply bring that same once a week to digital, the chance of it being equally effective is very low. So if I met with you for 1 hour a week, I probably saw you at other times. And in those other times at the water cooler or when I saw you, I had the opportunity for informal development. So formally 1 hour, but I informally developed you. There's no informal going on here. We have to schedule everything. So instead of meeting once a week, I would say anyone you met with once a week, double it. Meet with them twice a week on Zoom or on whatever we're using, but not for an hour each time. An hour is a very long time for a meeting. Shorten the meetings, but do it twice, once for your development, once for whatever else we were going to talk about. So make informal, deliberate. So I can achieve everything else, but I have to make adjustments for the new medium, if that makes sense.
Well, that's a great angle to tackle this issue, because this remote working is becoming kind of a burden for people who enjoy interacting face-to-face, or they feel much more comfortable to give and take feedback face-to-face. But I think we have to adjust to this new reality to a certain extent. So,
and when you have a one-on-one meeting, let me just say one thing. If I have a one-on-one meeting, don't be afraid to have it on the phone. We don't always have to see each other. In fact, sometimes it's a relief.
Right, great. So a couple of questions are arriving. Sorry that I'm glancing downwards to look at the screen to see the questions, and I'm short-sighted, like 8 degrees, so it is not an easy job for me to do that. So from the watchers as well. So companies are putting so much emphasis on performance targets. Do you believe that it will be necessary for the management to reinvent performance management to be much more purpose-driven than financial and short-term driven? So it is mainly the question about bringing much more social and purposeful impact to performance management.
Yeah. So here's my reaction to that. And at this point, it's probably not going to surprise you. So performance management, if I set performance targets, that's a subset of goals. Like, right, I've set a performance target goal. Here's how I know I've set a good goal. Did it make you perform better? Right. So if I set a goal that makes you perform better, I was effective in setting goals. If I set a goal that was either too far away that it totally didn't want you to perform, or it was too easy, it didn't bring out the best in you. So one is, goal setting doesn't change. A good goal is when it elevates someone else's performance. So you got to think about that in the new context. A good set of goals is that I want not just one goal, I want a set of goals so that I feel seen and that I feel purpose. So in the set of goals, please let me be as fully seen as possible. There's got to be purpose involved. So as an example, when I went to Uber and their performance management that they had in place, the goals were not many, and they were often very individually oriented. We had to put in some team goals, and then we also put in a community goal, which is we added a goal that how much do you contribute to the culture, either at Uber individually or to one of our extended community. By putting that in the set of goals, it revealed we find it's important and we want it to represent us. We wanted that to be how you were seen. So a good goal accelerates performance. A set of goals lets me be fully seen and fully represents what is important to me. That people might have to redo their goal setting in these periods of times makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay. So the question that we cannot totally elaborate, Emel Hanım has been giving some more details about it. She was mentioning a World Economic Forum report saying that given the COVID-19 crisis affects men and women in different ways, and women have been suffering more to be stuck in houses. Do you think this is going to negatively affect the diversity issue?
Now I get it.
Now we got it. Yes.
Now we got it. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Emel Hanım, for the details.
Yeah. So I think this is super important. That there's no question that in I think almost every country in the world, it's still at home. Women are taking, if there's two parents and if it's a traditional and it's a woman and a man, one person is taking more responsibility, and that one person tends to be a woman. Not in every household, but that's like often what it is. So if I have more responsibility at home and I'm homeschooling, so now I'm doing my day job and I'm also homeschooling. If I look at, this is what I used to contribute, and now I'm contributing less, and I'm going to hold that against you, that will obviously be bad. But from a company's perspective, if I become the most magnificent place to work for people that have a life, it'll be really good. Here's the thing about COVID-19. It's all around the world. So I think we have to be super cognizant of not holding people back because of this temporary moment in time. And that's what she's bringing up. And I think that this is a deliberate act we have to have. You could be a poor leader by saying, it was your performance during COVID that I'm going to use to promote you or to not promote you. That would be terrible. And that is a risk. I think the risk goes down the more we talk about it. So that clarification right there was awesome. And the more that companies talk about it, and you know the best way to talk about it? Leaders at the company to talk about their experience of being at home. Because here's the benefit that could happen. Before, I was working on like 10 things. Some were super important, some weren't, but I was just asked to do them. If I now bring ruthless prioritization into my life, I can actually be even more effective with less time. That's what I'd like to see, is let's practice ruthless prioritization in the midst of these shrinking time constraints. I think really cool things could happen.
Great. So, Frances, we have 10 minutes or so time left. So I would like you to spend every second of this 10 minutes to give us details about your Uber experience, because I believe that it is truly a case study. So just tell us how this story started. So what was your call for Uber?
Yeah. So I'll go back to it's something that happened before I went to Uber that facilitated the call.
Sure.
So before I went to Uber, I was involved in the reshaping the culture at HBS because women students used to underperform male students, both in grade point average and in self-reported satisfaction. We did some deliberate things and we were able to close that gap within a year. And it stayed closed for like 7 years. It was very good. We know it got better because the averages improved, but no person experienced both, right? Because if you were in this year, we changed the culture, the next year comes in, like, it's just somebody else comes into a higher satisfaction. So women were no longer disadvantaged, except one person. There was one person who experienced the difference. And this was a student who was here for the first year before the cultural change. She took some time off. We did the cultural change and she came back. So she came to meet with me after she graduated and said, I just want to tell you, like, I lived the experience and it was so palpable, the change. And I think it's extraordinary. And we developed a relationship. She's the one who called me for Uber. She called me and said, and this was right after the Susan Fowler blog and all of the publicity at Uber. And she said, will you please come and talk to our CEO? And I said, no. Like, I said, I've read all of the newspaper. It seems super conclusive, and I believe in the press. I love it. So it sounds like it's a terrible place. I don't want to use my discretionary time to go help a terrible place. And she said, please come talk to him. What you're reading in the press is a very narrow part of the story. I think that Travis is a really good man. I think he could use help. He thinks he could use help. Will you please come have a conversation? So it was for her that I flew to California. And when I got there, I had allocated an hour. I was going to fly back, but I stayed for 3 days. Travis and I just gelled. This was a super smart man who was thinking about everything. It wasn't narrow thinking, and he needed help. He asked for help. And he wanted help with leadership. And the last company he had managed had 8 people in it. This company now had like 13,000 people or whatever the number was. He's a brilliant strategist, but he wasn't effective at getting his strategy deeply embedded in the minds of all 13,000 people. So he asked for help on leadership and strategy. And by leadership, it extended to the culture. And so I was like, okay, like, you're worth investing in and partnering with and learning from and helping. I then also met with, I think, about 1,500 of the 13,000 people before I said yes. And I met with, I taught them, I was in small group meetings with them all over the world, because I had to satisfy myself. Like, if these are all bad people, I don't want to help them. But if these are mostly good people, I totally want to help them. They were overwhelmingly good people. And here's how you can tell that. So in about 9 months, the culture was completely changed. And we had done massive amounts of executive education to help improve strategy and help improve management, which turned out to be a critical factor. If you look at how many people the company separated with in June of 2017, it's about 20. 20 of 13,000. That was the separation needed to turn around the culture. Now, if you ask me, I think we needed to separate from 22 people. And we didn't have the courage for the other 2. And that cost us. But we got it mostly right. And so if you look at 20 versus 13,000, and I'm not even saying they were bad people, they just couldn't stay in the company for this part. So I think that was the first part. And when I got there, some things were super clear. You got promoted, you got hired as an individual contributor, hyper growth. You got promoted to a manager almost immediately. You don't know how to manage, and no one taught you how to manage. And then soon after that, you got promoted to a manager of manager, another set of management skills again. So what we had to do, these people, they were unbelievable learners. Nobody had taught them. I used to joke, nobody gave them the secret memos on how to do management. Well, you and I both know management can be taught. Absolutely. So we started teaching management. I started doing it myself, and then I partnered with HBS, and HBS faculty came in and started teaching management and leadership. these were the most eager group of learners to this day I've ever been involved with. So we taught them about management and leadership. They totally got it, and then they started fixing it. And there were 3,000 managers when I got there, and very few of them were effective. And it was none of their fault. It hadn't been taught. And these are, average age of 27. Like, this could have been your first job. So unless you were born knowing how to manage, someone had to teach it to you. So that was the backdrop of it. And we went after the culture. So here are some things I think are quite generalizable. One is, if the average age of your workforce is 27, you must teach deliberately management and leadership. People aren't born knowing it. And I find that to be the case at so many companies today. So that's the first thing, massive amount of education to come in. The second one, even if your strategy is awesome, if it's in the minds of 10 people or in the minds of a document, it is not going to guide discretionary behavior. That's going to limit its effectiveness. So whatever your strategy is, its measure of success is how much does it guide discretionary behavior. And you have two tools to guide discretionary behavior: strategy and culture. So the strategy at Uber, I think Travis understood it, but not everyone did. And it goes down to this level. Should we be the lowest price, or should we be differentiating on service? To this day, I think the company still struggles with that. Because if I ask you as a customer, are you going to pick, in the US, Uber or Lyft? In India, it was Uber or Ola or whatever it is anywhere in the world. People were saying, I'm picking on price. We thought we were differentiating on service. So you got to pick one. We weren't differentiating enough on service that you would pay extra. And of course, that's the limit. Am I doing it? So I think we had to teach about that. On the culture part, here's what we found, and I see this now all the time. The cultural values that were at Uber were super important to the 27-year-olds. When they would send a message to one another, they'd go #cultural value number 4 or #cultural value number 2. This was a culture-driven organization, which is what most of us want. But here's the problem. Some of the cultural values, which were beautifully designed and articulated and beautifully put into place, I love the rigor, the comprehension, some of them had become weaponized. Some of them were contributing to a toxic culture. And here's what I mean by weaponized. So there's this magnificent value that was there, and a part of the value was toe stepping. And what it said is that if you have a great idea, no matter how junior you are in the organization, we want to hear it throughout the organization. So surface all of the ideas. And if you're in the unfortunate position where your manager is trying to stifle your ideas, step on your manager's toes and go above them. This was to get out all the great ideas. Now that's awesome. That's what we want. Except here's what happened. Soon, senior people were using toe stepping on the way down the hierarchy. As opposed to get my ideas up, I'm going to step on your toes to get my way. It's not at all what Travis intended. And so I think what we learned is Travis and other founders were trying to reclaim the cultural value and just re-explain what it meant. It doesn't work. As soon as it becomes weaponized, you got to let it go. And then you have to go through the process of redoing the cultural values, which we did in the fall of 2017. And those are still in place today. And by the way, one of those new cultural values, celebrate difference, to exactly the point that we had here, the part that you liked about the inclusion dial. So ask me another question. I'm not good at just speaking.
Great. So as much as I heard, you said that you have changed, or Uber's culture has been changed in 9 months or something. Yeah. Lots of the articles I read says that it takes at least 7 years to change a company's culture in a significant way. So how did you do the magic?
Yeah, well, it's actually, I think that's how long it took. I think that if you can't change a culture in a year, let's call it a year, please don't bother. If you have a 5-year plan to change a culture, I think you're going to be wasting most of the time. Now, you're going to think it sounds crazy, but now I'm going to give you an explanation that's not going to have it sound crazy. The only way you can change a culture is if it's your top priority. No one is going to make culture change their top priority for 5 years. No one. So what you'll have been doing in those 5 years is it will have gone from my top priority to a lower priority, to a top priority to a lower priority. And what will happen as you're toggling back and forth is you'll inject cynicism into the organization. You're saying it's important, but you're acting it's not. Other things become more important and less important. So what I'm saying is condense all of those moments when it was the top priority. It's going to be about a year out of the 5 years. In fact, it's going to be, and then the benefits, you didn't inject cynicism. And I think this is true, frankly, for all change. All meaningful change should happen quickly. Here's another test. Ask anyone who has led meaningful change and ask them, I haven't ever been able to find someone who has said, gosh, I wish I had taken longer. I've also never heard anyone say, gosh, I wish I had have done less. Never. So when you're going to change, do it faster and do more. Don't parse out change. Do it all at once.
Great. So one of the things, I think we have a very limited amount of time left, but I think you have done some very interesting things in order to make people come around the culture, like T-shirts and other things. Can you just give a couple of examples about that?
Yeah, so here's the thing. When I got to Uber, which I fell in love with the company. I loved its mission, of letting people not be reliant on having to drive, my mother in particular, that's going to liberate her. So I love the company. I love the people. I was really proud to be associated with a company that wanted to change. But when I got there, the employees weren't proud of the company. You know how I knew that? They used to wear Uber T-shirts. Everyone stopped. People had stopped telling Uber drivers that they worked with the company. People had stopped going to parties because Uber was going to be the topic of conversation and they didn't want to have to represent Uber. I was proud of what we were doing, but the employees weren't. And so I said, listen, I'm going to wear an Uber T-shirt every day until everyone else feels licensed to wear an Uber T-shirt again. And so I wore an Uber T-shirt for 9 months straight, every day, 7 days a week, on Christmas, on others. It made a couple of formal events odd, but I did it every day. And I have to tell you, by the time I left, and if you go there today, the wearing of a T-shirt, and you think, oh, the T-shirt, it's silly. It's not. It's actually, if I choose not to, fine. But if I'm afraid to, that's a really big cultural sign. And so that's actually one of the markers of a successful cultural turnaround. Am I proud of the association?
Thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed talking with you, but this is our time is up. So thank you very much for joining our stream today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Hope to host you soon for more and more interesting subjects as well. Thank you.
And I look forward to returning to Istanbul live when we're permitted.
Be sure that you will receive a warm welcome here. Thank you very much, Frances.
Okay, thank you.